Hey everybody, I'm Carl Lanning, Brazos River Charter School with This Week in History, specifically the week of November 1st through 7th. So let's see, this week we have Mr. Walter Cronkite. On November 4th of 1916, Walter Cronkite was born. Cronkite is best known as the CBS Evening News anchorman for 19 years, which ended with his semi-retirement in 1981. On the occasion of several polls in the 60s and 70s, Cronkite earned the title of the most trusted man in America. Now, he covered almost every major event that happened in the world from 1937 until 1981, but he really earned his chops during World War II. There he is, where he went on several bomber missions over Germany, even on one occasion firing a nose-mounted machine gun at a attacking German fighter. He also landed in a glider with paratroopers during what was called Operation Market Garden, and was reporting on the Battle of the Bulge while he was attached to General Patton's army. However, in 1968, he may have actually had a hand in making history. Earlier that year, Walter Cronkite had traveled to Vietnam to report on the aftermath of the Tet Offensive. Now, government and military officials have been telling the American people that the Vietnam War was winding down. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were on their last legs. You could see the light at the end of the tunnel. They managed to attack every major U.S. military and civilian target in South Vietnam simultaneously, including even briefly taking over the embassy in the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon. In other words, the impossible had happened, according to the military and political leadership. Upon his return to the United States, Cronkite went on the air with an editorial stating that essentially, quote, the only way out of Vietnam, was to negotiate an exit as, quote, an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could. Now, President Lyndon Johnson, very famously, had a cabinet with 3 televisions in it so that he could watch all 3 of the then 3 network news broadcasts simultaneously. Upon hearing Cronkite's editorial, he allegedly said to an aide, if I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost middle America. Supposedly, this is when he started considering his decision to not run for re-election that year. So, Walter Cronkite. On November 4th of 1939, the Packard Car Company produced the first car with factory-installed air conditioning. Now, this was a $249 option, about $5,000 today. The whole setup, I'm afraid I was not able to find an actual picture of one except for a terrible picture, but the whole setup, as shown in this ad, took up about half the space of the trunk. There was no temperature control. You could control the blower speed, but the blower would be on as long as the engine was running. The only way to turn it off was the driver would have to actually shut the engine off, open the trunk, and remove the belt that actually worked the unit itself. Also, the extensive plumbing and ductwork had reliability issues. It wasn't until 1953 that Chrysler finally came up with a really good factory-installed option for air conditioning, but God bless Packard for working on the godsend of air conditioning. Now, I'm afraid I was not able to find photographs of the actual players in this next little bit, but an unusual murder case. I mentioned to you last week, a strange murder witness, possibly. On November 3rd of 1991, the body of Jane Gill was discovered having been apparently smothered in her home. Her business partner was a man named Gary Rasp. Now, he maintained his innocence until the end, but he was accused and eventually convicted of the murder. Mr. Rasp had no alibi to his whereabouts at the time of the murder. He had taken out a large life insurance policy on Miss Gill and stood to profit handsomely if his business partner were to meet her demise. Now, Mrs. Gill, though, owned a 36-year-old African gray parrot by the name of Max. Now, Max was found when her body was found, but he was in very, very poor condition. So he was sent to a pet shop that specialized in parrots. Turns out, according to Jane Gill's friends, one of Max's favorite pastimes was actually imitating her. Well, as soon as Max had recovered after a couple of days of being fed and watered, the very first words he said were, "George, no, no, no." Now, the pet shop owner contacted investigators who witnessed the bird repeating those words, "George, no, no, no," again and again and again. This led them to a man named George Mattoon. Now, he was a reported close friend and former housemate of Gill's, who testified that he last saw her the night before her murder. Now, just as the defendant's lawyers, Mr. Rasp's lawyers, were about to ask one of the investigators on the stand about Max the parrot, the prosecution objected and the judge would not allow Max to be mentioned any further in court. As mentioned earlier, Gary was convicted, not George. So, as it turns out, there's only one animal whose testimony, so to speak, is allowed in some states and never as primary evidence, only to corroborate human evidence. It's only very rarely been allowed, and as I said, never as key evidence in a case, and that is as a bloodhound. But it has to be a full-blooded bloodhound and also has to have some sort of certification as far as being a trained tracking animal. So, well, that's it for this week in history, but next week, we'll see if we can't figure out why this aid to childbirth just never really caught on. It's a pretty weird invention. Thank you for your time. I'm Carl Lanning, Brazos River Charter School, and we look forward to seeing you right here next week.